Following its defeat in World War I, Germany was plunged into humiliation, poverty, and despair. The streets were filled with aimless veterans, starving families and children growing up amidst the ruins of a fallen empire. The Treaty of Versailles not only disarmed the country, it also robbed it of its pride, its industry, and its identity. What was once the heart of European power became a nation scarred by debt and resentment. In 1918, when the cannons of the Great War finally fell silent, Germany had not only lost a battle, it had lost its soul. Millions of men who had fought at the Somme or Verdun returned with tattered uniforms, empty hands, and vacant stares. The homeland for which they had shed their blood no longer existed. The Kaiser had fled, the army had surrendered, and the imperial flag lay in dust and shame in that void of hope and direction. Something more dangerous than defeat was born: the desire for revenge. Wounded pride began to transform into a dark force, a yearning to reclaim lost greatness at any cost. It was then that a man appeared who promised to restore German honor, to return the work, strength, and power that the world had taken from them. Adolf Hitler knew how to transform collective resentment into a mass movement. With fiery speeches and promises of rebirth, he transformed humiliation into faith and rage into obedience. Through propaganda, fear, and fanaticism, he molded an entire nation willing to believe that war could be salvation. Thus, from the ashes of the German Empire, the Third Reich was born, a dream of power that would soon turn into a nightmare for the entire world. The Treaty of Versailles was the perfect symbol of that humiliation. Imposed by the victorious powers, it forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and to pay impossible reparations. It lost its colonies, part of its territory, and its army was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The imperial fleet was dismantled, and even the once proud German Air Force was banned. Each clause of the treaty was an open wound that reminded the people that they were no longer the heirs of a great empire, but a subjugated nation. The consequences were devastating. The economy collapsed and inflation reached absurd levels. Bills printed in the millions became worthless overnight. There are photographs that say it all: children playing with wads of money, women using banknotes as fuel, entire families selling their belongings for a piece of bread. Poverty mingled with rage and rage with resentment. The newly born Republic, Weimar, tried to maintain order, but its foundations were weak. In Parliament, the struggles between communists, social democrats, and nationalists made governing impossible. Germany was politically fragmented, socially devastated, and morally humiliated. In that climate of despair, a collective feeling emerged: the conviction that Germany had not lost the war on the front, but at home. The myth of the stab in the back was born, a false but powerful idea, according to this narrative. The German army had been invincible on the battlefield, but was betrayed by politicians, communists, and especially by Jews. This myth, fueled by nationalists and former officers, offered a simple explanation for an incomprehensible defeat. And most dangerously, it provided an enemy on whom to shift the blame. As the streets erupted in political violence, paramilitary organizations like the Freikorps emerged to protect the country from chaos. They were hardened, resentful, and hopeless war veterans who brutally confronted communists and strikers. They were the remnants of the old imperial army, men who could not accept defeat. Ideas of revenge, national purity, and a future resurgence circulated among them. Gradually, nationalism began to take the form of a faith. In that context, the German people began to look back with nostalgia. They remembered the days of order, of authority, of an empire that once commanded respect from the world. Many began to believe that only a strong leader could restore their lost dignity. Democracy for them represented not freedom but weakness. The 1920s progressed amid crises, coup attempts, and a feeling that the country was adrift. German pride, though wounded, remained alive. In every family there was someone who spoke nostalgically of the past, of the times when Germany was powerful and respected. In the factories, the workers cursed the government and dreamed of a new beginning. In the schools, the children learned that their homeland had been unjustly humiliated. The wound of Versailles did not heal. It became infected day by day, fueled by frustration and propaganda. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the situation became untenable. Millions lost their jobs, banks collapsed, and despair gripped the population. It was then that the rhetoric of resentment became a political weapon. Amid the ruins of the Republic, a movement began to gain strength, promising what everyone wanted to hear: an end to humiliation, the recovery of pride, national unity, and the restoration of lost greatness. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party knew how to exploit that collective pain. They offered a narrative that gave meaning to the misfortune. Germany had been betrayed, but it could be reborn. They promised jobs, stability, and revenge. And for a nation broken from within, those words sounded like redemption. Nazism did not arise from nothing. It was born from hunger, resentment, and the wounded pride of a people who refused to accept their downfall. World War II was not just a war of armies, it was a war of memories and wounds. What began as a promise to restore lost honor turned into one of humanity's greatest tragedies, because when a nation's wounded pride mixes with fanaticism, the result is not redemption, but destruction. The rebirth of the Reich between hope and fanaticism. At the beginning of the 1930s, Germany was on the verge of collapse. The Weimar Republic, born of defeat and humiliation, was dying amidst political, economic, and social crises. Inflation had wiped out the savings of millions of families, unemployment had reached unbearable levels, and confidence in democratic institutions was eroding. People no longer believed in politicians or empty promises. They wanted change, they wanted order, they wanted to feel proud of being German again. In that atmosphere, the message of the National Socialist Party began to resonate with unstoppable force. Adolf Hitler did not present himself to the people as just another politician, but as a savior. In his speeches, he promised to restore national dignity, break the chains of the Treaty of Versailles, and return Germany to its rightful place in the world. He wasn't talking about democracy, but about unity. He wasn't offering dialogue, but leadership. His words were laden with emotion, pride, and resentment, and that was precisely what millions needed to hear. Through a simple yet powerful discourse, Hitler was able to transform collective pain into an ideology of national redemption. Nazism did not take hold overnight. It grew like a shadow. It infiltrated every corner of German society: schools, trade unions, churches, and even sports clubs. The propaganda, meticulously crafted by Joseph Goebbels, became one of the regime's most effective weapons. Posters depicted a bright future, happy faces, fertile fields, and functioning factories. Everything seemed to promise a rebirth, a new Germany free from misery and despair. But that dream came at a price: total submission. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor. From that moment, Germany's fate changed forever. Within months, the foundations of democracy crumbled. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, newspapers silenced, and individual freedoms eliminated. The Reichstag fire was the perfect pretext for establishing legalized terror. Under the guise of order, the country became a dictatorship. The Führer had promised to restore greatness, and the people, weary of chaos, applauded him. The new regime needed more than political power. It needed faith. Thus, the cult of Hitler was born. Mass rallies, marches, flags, and speeches were transformed into a political liturgy. National Socialism presented itself not as a mere ideology, but as a secular religion with its own symbols, martyrs, and dogmas. The swastika, the salute, the oath of allegiance. Every gesture was a declaration of devotion. Hitler was not just a leader, he was the embodiment of Germany itself. In parallel, the regime began a profound economic and social transformation. Large public works projects, such as highways, factories, and industrial projects, were launched, restoring employment and hope to millions. The economy seemed to be reviving, unemployment was decreasing, and national pride was flourishing once again. Many Germans sincerely believed that the country had been resurrected, but what appeared to be an economic miracle was, in reality, the prelude to a carefully planned war machine. Every project, every investment, every speech had one objective: to prepare Germany for conquest. The recovery was not based on freedom, but on control. Young people were indoctrinated from childhood in the Hitler Youth, where they learned that obedience was a virtue, war a duty, and the Führer a father. Women were trained to serve the Reich as mothers and guardians of the race. Education, culture, and even science were subordinated to ideology. In universities, Jewish professors and students were expelled. In theaters, censorship decided what could be performed, and in bookstores, non-German books were burned in bonfires organized by the state itself. As Hitler's power grew, so did his vision of a new order. Germany had to be purified of undesirable elements. Jews, communists, homosexuals, the disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, all were labeled enemies of the people. The persecution began gradually, first with discriminatory laws, then with open violence. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws sealed the fate of millions by stripping them of their citizenship and fundamental rights. That wasn't an excess, it was part of the plan. Racism was no longer an opinion, it was the law of the land. But while hatred became institutionalized, the masses applauded pride, not fear, filled the streets. For many Germans, the promise was being fulfilled. There was work, stability, and a sense of belonging. Few dared to question the price of this apparent prosperity, and those who did disappeared into the darkness of the concentration camps, originally created for political opponents and later converted into extermination centers. The Germany of the Third Reich was a living paradox. It was a country that felt reborn, but whose soul was corrupted. While marches paraded amidst red flags and torches, while anthems echoed in stadiums and factories resumed operations, the poison of fanaticism spread silently. The people saw not chains, but promises. They heard not cries for help, but speeches of unity. They saw not victims, but enemies. The Reich's rebirth was, on the surface, a national triumph. But in reality, it was the beginning of its self-destruction. What began as hope transformed into obsession. What started as redemption became hatred. Germany, in its attempt to erase the humiliation of the past, ended up creating a new hell, this time deeper and more devastating. The Reich was reborn, yes, but it was built on the foundations of lies, manipulation, and bloodshed. Fanaticism, disguised as hope, had triumphed. The people who dreamed of greatness ended up kneeling before totalitarianism. And as the flags waved under the skies of the new Reich, the world watched, not imagining that this resurgence would not be the beginning of a new era of glory, but the prelude to the chaos that would soon engulf the entire planet. The beginning of the imperial dream, the birth of the ambition that changed the world. The imperial dream of the Third Reich did not spring from nothing. It was the culmination of an ambition that had been brewing long before Hitler came to power. In the heart of Germany, humiliated after the First World War, the desire to recover its prestige, its territory, and its power had remained dormant. Many Germans viewed the Treaty of Versailles as an open wound, a humiliation that had to be avenged. Hitler understood this collective sentiment and transformed it into a project of conquest. In his mind, Germany not only had to be reborn, it had to dominate. From the early years of the regime, the idea of a new German empire was carefully crafted in the Führer's speeches. The Third Reich was presented as the glorious continuation of the Holy Roman Empire and Bismarck's empire. History was reinterpreted to present the German people as the heirs to an almost divine mission. To rule Europe, this mystical vision of national destiny was reinforced by an ideology that blended racism, extreme nationalism, and social Darwinism. According to Nazi ideology, Germans were the superior race, destined by nature to expand and dominate inferior peoples. The imperial project began in the mind, but quickly took shape in politics and economics. Germany initiated a gigantic rearmament process, secretly at first and then brazenly. Factories that previously produced civilian machinery were converted into military plants. Young men were called up for military service. Scientists and engineers began designing new weapons, airplanes, and tanks. The German army, banned by the Treaty of Versailles, was reborn as the Wehrmacht. Within a few years, the country that had been demilitarized once again became a heavily armed power. The imperial dream required territory, and Hitler had already precisely defined his objective: Lebensraum, living space. In his book Mein Kampf, he had explained that Germany had to expand eastward, conquer the vast lands of Eastern Europe, and subjugate its inhabitants. It wasn't just about gaining space to live, it was a project of racial colonization. The Slavic peoples, considered subhuman by Nazi ideology, would be enslaved or exterminated to make room for German settlers. This was the core of the imperial dream, a Germanized Europe, purified and organized under the domination of the Reich. The first step was Austria. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border without firing a single shot. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, was presented as a reunification of the Germanic peoples. The streets of Vienna were filled with swastika flags and crowds cheering Hitler as a hero. The world watched in astonishment but did not react. In the offices of London and Paris, the prevailing idea was to avoid another conflict. For Hitler, that passivity was a sign. He could continue advancing. Months later, the Führer set his sights on Czechoslovakia. He demanded the handover of the Sudetenland, a region inhabited by German minorities. The Western powers yielded once again. In September 1938, at the Munich Conference, the United Kingdom and France accepted Hitler's demands, convinced that this would prevent a war. But the Nazi leader interpreted that concession as a personal victory. Czechoslovakia was dismembered, and the rest of the country fell under German control. In March 1939, Germany had grown without firing a shot. The imperial dream was now an expanding reality. However, Hitler knew that the next step would involve war. Poland was the central target of his plan. Its strategic location and vast territory made it the gateway to the east. To avoid a two-front war, Germany signed a surprising pact with its ideological enemy. The Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, included a secret clause that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would keep Western Poland, the USSR, the eastern part, and the Baltic states. It was a cynical but effective agreement. On September 1, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. In just a few weeks, the country was crushed under the Blitzkrieg tactic, the lightning war. It was a new form of warfare, coordinated attacks by tanks, aircraft, and artillery that disrupted the enemy before they could react. Speed, precision, and terror were their primary weapons. Days later, on September 3rd, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. But in the early years of the conflict, the imperial dream seemed to be triumphing. In less than 2 years, the Reich conquered Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The map of Europe was stained with the colors of the Third Reich. Swastika flags flew from Paris to Warsaw. Hitler became, in the eyes of many Germans, the man who had restored lost honor. Germany was no longer the defeated nation of 1918. It was the heart of a rising empire. However, behind the apparent glory lurked the seeds of destruction. The imperial dream was not based on cooperation, but on subjugation. The conquered lands were plundered, their populations enslaved, and their resources exploited to sustain the war machine. Nazi officers and the SS imposed a reign of terror, suppressing any form of resistance. As the empire grew, so did its cruelty. The German imperial dream was as ambitious as it was unsustainable. Hitler didn't simply want to control Europe, he wanted to transform it. He dreamed of a new civilization, a continent molded according to the principles of National Socialism, with Berlin as the capital of the world, renamed Germania, a monumental city that would reflect the eternal power of the Reich. Albert Speer's architectural plans depicted a colossal future, a megalomaniacal vision of grandeur that never came to fruition, but the dream began to crumble when military reality began to take hold. In 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union opened a gigantic front that would consume the Reich's resources, and with it, the imperial dream began to transform into a nightmare. What should have been a glorious eastward expansion became a brutal and bloody war of attrition. Millions of soldiers and civilians died, and the Nazi machine began to show its limits. The imperial dream that had begun as a promise of greatness ended up revealing its true nature, a project based on hatred, unbridled ambition, and destruction. What for many Germans was a symbol of national pride, for the whole world became the most devastating proof of how far a nation can go when it confuses power with destiny and supremacy with the right to dominate. Europe under the banner of the Reich, the unstoppable expansion of Nazi power. As German columns advanced along the roads of Europe, they brought not only war but also a new form of order. Within a few years, almost the entire European continent was under the rule of the Third Reich. From the beaches of Normandy to the Ukrainian steppes, the swastika flag flew, a symbol of an empire that intended to last 1,000 years. For many Europeans, the war was no longer distant news. It was a presence felt in the streets, in schools, in homes, and in everyday fear. Nazi expansion was not simply a military process, but a total reorganization of the continent. Wherever the army advanced, the political and administrative apparatus of the Reich was imposed with bureaucratic precision. The occupied countries were divided according to their usefulness to Germany. Some were directly annexed, others were turned into protectorates or satellite states under puppet governments. France was divided in two, with a north occupied by German troops and a seemingly free south, controlled by the collaborationist Vichy regime in Norway. Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, the occupation resulted in repression, looting, and Germanization. Each region had an assigned role within the grand design of the empire. Western Europe was to serve as a source of industrial resources and labor. Eastern Europe, as a territory for colonization and racial exploitation in Poland, the terror was immediate. Universities were closed, intellectual elites arrested, and thousands of peasants expelled from their lands to make room for German settlers. Cities became administrative centers of the Reich, and concentration camps began to multiply, hidden behind barbed wire. The Nazi regime imposed its rule not only with weapons, but also with symbol squares were renamed, statues removed, and portraits of Hitler hung in public buildings. The swastika flew from town halls and train stations. Newspapers published speeches by the Führer and propaganda slogans about European unity under German leadership. In Berlin, Goebbels spoke of a new Europe, free from chaos, communism, and liberal decadence. It was the ideological mask of domination, a project that promised order but was sustained by oppression and fear in every occupied country. Daily life became a mixture of adaptation and resistance. Many civilians were forced to collaborate in order to survive. Others, driven by desperation or patriotism, joined the underground movements that began to emerge throughout Europe. In France, the Maquis organized sabotage. In Poland, the resistance maintained secret intelligence and refuge networks. In Yugoslavia, communist partisans fought in the mountains against the invaders. But for every act of rebellion, the repression was brutal. Public executions, mass deportations, destruction of entire villages. The Reich's economic machine transformed Europe into an inexhaustible source of resources. Factories, mines, and fields were all put at the service of the German war industry. Millions of workers were deported from their countries of origin to work in inhumane conditions in Germany. Trains, a symbol of industrial progress, were transformed into instruments of Nazi domination, transporting soldiers, materials, and human beings. The entire continent functioned like a great machine designed to fuel the power of Berlin. In the occupied territories of the East, brutality reached extreme levels. Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states were turned into scenes of extermination and plunder. German troops and the SS implemented the scorched earth policy. Villages burned, crops confiscated, entire populations exterminated as punishment or warning. Soviet political commissars were summarily executed, and Jews were persecuted with a systematic rigor that foreshadowed the implementation of the final solution. For the Nazis, the East was not Europe. It was a space destined to be emptied, repopulated, and transformed into the agrarian heart of the new empire. But the regime was not maintained solely through terror. There were also those who, out of conviction or self-interest, joined the Reich's project. In several countries, local fascist movements emerged that saw Germany as a model to follow. In Hungary, Romania, Croatia, Italy, and Slovakia, Allied governments adopted National Socialist ideology, contributing to the persecution of Jews and political opponents. Nazi propaganda spoke of a new Europe, a community of nations united by the fight against communism and capitalism. However, in practice, that unity was an illusion. Germany commanded, the others obeyed. Life under the Reich meant constant surveillance. Curfews, requisitions, censorship, and arbitrary arrests were all part of daily life. Citizens learned to speak in hushed tones, to distrust their neighbors, and to hide their radios to listen to banned stations. Fear became part of the air. Schools taught lessons in obedience. Young people were recruited into fascist organizations. Religion, culture, and the press were subjected to the will of the state. Everything had to serve the same purpose, to keep alive the idea of the Reich as an inevitable destiny. German dominance reached its peak between 1941 and 1942. At that time, almost all of continental Europe was under Nazi control, but the vastness of the empire contained its own weakness. Maintaining control over so many different nations, cultures, and peoples was an impossible task. Constant repression bred resistance. Looting produced hunger, and fear slowly turned into hatred. As German troops continued to advance eastward, the home front began to fracture. The arrogance of power blinded the leaders of the Reich. They believed that victory was certain, that their rule was unquestionable. Berlin became the center of the world, while the occupied capitals lived between submission and suppressed rage, but the balance was fragile. Every military triumph brought new enemies, every conquest, new rebellions. The Nazi Empire, which presented itself as a symbol of order, was in reality a system of oppression sustained by violence. Europe under the banner of the Reich was a continent subdued by force, but never fully conquered. Behind the apparent calm of the occupied streets, the spirit of freedom remained dormant in basements, in forests, in the dark corridors of cities. Anonymous men and women kept the hope of liberation alive. And when the tide of war began to turn, that hope turned into action. The Reich's banner, which had symbolized absolute power, began to fade under the weight of its own ambition. In the end, Europe survived Nazi rule, but not without scars. The ruins of entire cities, the extermination camps, and the millions of dead remained as a reminder of the price of that imperial dream. The continent that Hitler wanted to unify by force was reborn from the ashes, determined never to repeat that horror. However, the shadow of the Reich continued to loom over European memory for decades, as a warning of what happens when power becomes faith and obedience replaces humanity. The invisible war, control, censorship, and propaganda. While the armies of the Third Reich advanced across Europe and cannons thundered on every front, another war was being waged in silence. An invisible war, without weapons or trenches, but just as decisive. It was the war for the mind, the war for control of thought. In it, bullets were replaced by words, bombs by images, and truth became a malleable tool in the service of power. From the early years of the regime, Joseph Goebbels understood that to dominate a nation it was not enough to control its economy or its army. It was necessary to control its perception of the world. As Minister of Propaganda for the Reich, he built a system that penetrated every corner of daily life. Nothing escaped its influence. Newspapers, film, radio, books, music, art, education, and even conversations in homes. Nazi propaganda was not simply information. It was a form of constant indoctrination, designed to shape emotions, beliefs, and collective identity. The regime created a closed universe where only one truth existed, that of the Führer. The media were nationalized or placed under direct surveillance. Journalists who did not follow party directives were expelled, imprisoned, or silenced. The press became a uniform echo chamber of power. Headlines glorified German victories, concealed defeats, and exalted Hitler as an almost divine, infallible, and providential leader. Every news item, every image, every word was carefully selected to reinforce a single idea. Germany was destined to rule the world. Film was one of the most powerful instruments of this invisible war. Under the supervision of the Ministry of Propaganda, the UFA and Tobis studios produced hundreds of films that blended entertainment and indoctrination. Some extolled the unity of the German people and the heroism of their soldiers. Others, more subtle, glorified obedience, sacrifice, and racial purity. Director Leni Riefenstahl elevated propaganda to the level of art with works like Triumph of the Will and Olympia. Visually majestic films that presented Nazism as an almost divine force, aesthetics, music, and narrative merged to project an image of perfection, power, and inevitable destiny. Radio, for its part, was the heart of mass indoctrination. Goebbels called it the most powerful weapon of the 20th century. Millions of low-cost receivers, known as Volksempfänger, people's radios, were distributed throughout Germany. Thanks to them, Hitler's voice could reach every home, every factory, every corner of the nation. The speeches were delivered with theatrical precision, pauses, shouts, silences, and emotions measured down to the millimeter to generate fervor and obedience. In the streets, in the squares, and even in the schools, collective listening sessions were organized. No one could escape the Führer's voice, but propaganda didn't just glorify, it also created enemies. Anti-Semitism, which had been present since the beginning of the Nazi movement, became an everyday tool for channeling fear and hatred. Posters, films, and pamphlets portrayed Jews as parasites, traitors, or the cause of all the world's ills. Inflation, The Defeat of 1918, communism, moral decay films like The Eternal Jew or Seuss the Jew spread hatred disguised as documentaries or historical dramas. It was a meticulously designed campaign to dehumanize a part of the population, psychologically preparing the people to accept and even justify the genocide that would follow. Thought control was exercised not only through the media, but also through fear. Censorship was total books deemed contrary to the German spirit were removed from libraries and publicly burned in ceremonies organized by the Hitler Youth. Thousands of works by Jewish, communist, pacifist, or simply critical authors were destroyed. In universities, professors and students were required to swear allegiance to the regime. Knowledge ceased to be a path to freedom and became an instrument of control. Culture was purged and rebuilt in the image of the Reich. Censorship also extended to art, music, and science. Composers like Mendelssohn and Mahler were banned because of their Jewish heritage. Modern artists were labeled degenerate. And scientists and academics who did not conform to the Nazi ideal were expelled or exiled. Only art that glorified purity, strength, and heroism was permitted. Official exhibitions showcased perfect bodies, smiling peasants, valiant soldiers, and Aryan mothers. Anything that did not fit into that idealized vision of the world had to disappear. In the occupied territories, propaganda took on new forms in France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Poland. The Nazis published newspapers in local languages, broadcast friendly radio programs, and promoted films that portrayed the occupation as an alliance or a liberation in some places. They even fostered anti-communist sentiment to recruit collaborators. But behind this facade of order, control was absolute. Opponents were arrested, local media outlets were shut down, and any criticism of the Reich was punishable by death. Within Germany, the Gestapo and the SS completed the circle of control. Spreading propaganda was not enough. Any dissent had to be eliminated. Conversations were monitored. Denunciations between neighbors became commonplace, and the mere suspicion of a defeatist attitude could lead to imprisonment or a concentration camp. This created a society where self-censorship was the law, where even thoughts were repressed for fear of being overheard. Nazi propaganda was more than a political tool. It was a form of mental colonization. It succeeded in transforming hatred into virtue, obedience into duty, and violence into justice. For years, millions of people sincerely believed they were fighting for a higher ideal, unaware that they were victims of monumental manipulation. In the end, when the Allied bombs began to fall on Berlin and the regime's lies became impossible to sustain, many Germans faced emptiness. The propaganda crumbled, and with it the illusion the invisible war had ended, but its mark remained etched in the collective consciousness. Because that war, the war of thought, word, and truth, proved that mind control can be more powerful than any army, and that when truth submits to power, all of humanity risks losing its soul. The Eastern Front, the crusade against Bolshevism. On June 22, 1941, as dawn broke over the eastern fields, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in what would become the largest invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. For the Nazi leaders, it was not just a military offensive, it was an ideological war, a crusade against what they called the racial and political enemy of the German people. Bolshevism, Adolf Hitler, presented it as a battle between civilization and barbarism, between the purity of the Reich and communist chaos. But behind those words lay an unprecedented plan of conquest, extermination, and enslavement. From the very beginning, Nazi propaganda portrayed the invasion of the Soviet Union as a sacred mission. German soldiers marched on, convinced that they were fighting for the survival of Europe. Hitler and Goebbels' speeches claimed that communism was a Jewish virus that had to be eradicated to secure the continent's future. Every bullet fired, every town occupied, was presented as an act of ideological purification. This narrative transformed a war of territorial expansion into a racial and existential conflict. The scale of the operation was colossal: more than 3,000 kilometers of front, thousands of tanks, aircraft, and infantry divisions were deployed from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. At first, the victories seemed to confirm the myth of German invincibility. The Axis forces advanced with impressive speed, encircling and destroying entire armies. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv fell one after another. Millions of Soviet prisoners were captured within weeks, and propaganda in Berlin proclaimed that the war in the East would end before winter. But the enemy they faced was unlike any they had ever known. The Red Army, though poorly prepared in the early months, put up a fierce fight. The civilian population, far from surrendering, began destroying crops, factories, and railways to leave nothing of use to the invaders. The war in the East quickly transformed into a conflict of total extermination, where international law and morality vanished. Soviet political commissars were summarily executed, towns deemed infested with partisans were razed, and millions of civilians were killed simply for existing under German rule. The so-called crusade against Bolshevism served as justification for one of the most brutal extermination campaigns of the 20th century. The SS and the Einsatzgruppen, mobile extermination units, closely followed the regular army, systematically murdering Jews, communists, intellectuals, and prisoners. In the camps and mass graves of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, the true prelude to the Holocaust began. The massacres of Babi Yar, Minsk, and Riga were just some of the episodes that left a trail of bloodshed accompanying the German advance. Hunger was also used as a weapon. The Hunger Plan, designed by the Reich's High Command, sought to deprive millions of people in occupied territories of food in order to redirect resources to Germany. It was estimated that more than 30 million Soviets could die of starvation. In many rural areas, the population was left to fend for itself. Entire cities were surrounded and cut off from supplies, such as Leningrad, where the siege lasted almost 900 days and cost the lives of more than 1 million civilians. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the apparent German invincibility began to crack. The Russian winter, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero, found the Reich's soldiers without adequate clothing, fuel, and sufficient food. Engines froze, rifles jammed, and the army began dying more from the cold than from bullets. In December 1941, Soviet troops launched a counter-offensive before Moscow that halted the German advance and marked the beginning of an irreversible shift. The war in the East became a prolonged nightmare. Every kilometer conquered was paid for with thousands of lives. Villages were burned, civilians executed, and prisoners abandoned. The brutality reached unprecedented levels. Mass executions, deportations, and forced labor camps proliferated across the front. Hitler's orders were clear. There would be no compassion or mercy. The Russians were considered subhuman, and their destruction was seen as a racial necessity. Over time, the propaganda promising a swift victory began to lose its power. The soldiers, who in 1941 believed in a glorious mission, now faced a relentless enemy and a hellish climate. The idea of a crusade crumbled in the face of the reality of exhaustion and horror. Letters sent to the front, censored by the regime, revealed a mixture of resignation, fear, and disillusionment. Many understood that they were trapped in a war they could no longer win. Stalingrad, the Battle of 1942, was the turning point. What began as an offensive to secure the southern flank of the front turned into an apocalyptic battle. The city, reduced to ruins, became a symbol of Soviet resistance. There, amidst the dust and rubble, the myth of German superiority was definitively shattered. The surrender of the Sixth Army in February 1943 was a devastating blow to the Reich. More than 300,000 men were trapped and destroyed, and with them the illusion of a final victory. The crusade against Bolshevism ended up devouring its own protagonists. What was presented as a redemptive mission became the largest cemetery of German soldiers. More than 4 million died on the Eastern Front, victims of enemy fire, cold, or hunger. The fields of the East, covered in bodies and ruins, became the scene of the total failure of Hitler and his ideology. When Soviet troops began their advance on Berlin in 1944, the reality was undeniable. The Reich's holy war had ended up being a self-imposed sentence. The ruins of cities, the frozen bodies in Russian forests, and the screams of murdered civilians remained as silent witnesses to one of the most inhuman campaigns in history. The crusade against Bolshevism was not a war of liberation but of annihilation, a war that revealed how far destruction can go when fanaticism replaces reason and ideology turns the enemy into something less than human. On the Eastern Front, the Reich's imperial dream shattered under the weight of its own brutality, leaving behind a legacy of pain that still resonates in the memory of the 20th century. Total War, the Nation in Arms. When the war began in 1939, few in Germany imagined that the conflict would become a fight for absolute survival. In its early years, the Nazi regime clung to the illusion of a swift and controlled war, a Blitzkrieg that would avoid the privations that had devastated the country during the First World War. However, as the front expanded and losses mounted, the Reich's dream transformed into a nightmare of total proportions. By 1943, the war was no longer just a matter for soldiers. It had become the fate of an entire nation. The concept of total war was not an improvised idea. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, proclaimed it fervently in his famous speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin on February 18, 1943, when the defeat at Stalingrad still weighed heavily on the country's morale. In that packed stadium, beneath swastika banners, Goebbels shouted to the crowd, "Do you want total war?" And the masses responded with a deafening roar. At that moment, the regime sealed its fate. There was no turning back. Every man, woman and child would be part of the war effort. The nation in arms was the Reich's last desperate attempt to sustain a collapsing system. Hitler, still dreaming of victory, ordered that all material, human and industrial resources be placed at the service of the war. The economy was completely militarized. Factories were reorganized to produce weapons, tanks and airplanes at a frenetic pace. Workers were subjected to endless workdays and labor rights virtually disappeared. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, played a key role in this process. With cold, methodical efficiency, he reorganized German industry to increase production to unprecedented levels, even under Allied bombing raids. In 1944, Germany was producing more weapons than ever before, even though its cities lay in ruins. But this industrial miracle came at a human cost. Millions of forced laborers, prisoners of war and deportees from across Europe were used as slave laborers in the Reich's factories, in tunnels, mines and underground plants. Thousands died from exhaustion, hunger or punishment. German society was also transformed into an ideological battleground, propaganda intensified to obsessive levels. Every defeat was presented as a strategic retreat, every bombed city as a symbol of heroic sacrifice. Radio, cinema, newspapers and posters kept repeating that victory was still possible, that the enemy was brutal and inhuman, and that the people's duty was to resist until their last breath. In schools, children were trained in the use of weapons. In the squares, Hitler Youth marched as if they were miniature armies, and in homes, mothers were exalted as the true fighters of the home front. Total war also meant the end of any distinction between combatant and civilian. Allied bombing raids on German cities, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Essen, turned urban centers into seas of fire. The nights were illuminated by the glow of incendiary bombs, while thousands of families took refuge in basements, listening as the world crumbled above their heads. Propaganda called these survivors soldiers of the homeland, elevating their suffering to an act of patriotism. But the reality was devastating. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 500,000 German civilians died in bombing raids. At the front, the pressure was unbearable. Defeats in the east and the Allied advance from the west were tearing the German army apart. Young men were dying by the tens of thousands, and replacements were becoming increasingly scarce. In late 1944, Hitler ordered total mobilization. Teenagers were drafted, the elderly were sent into the militia, and the last reserves of fuel and ammunition were used up in desperate offensives like the Battle of the Bulge. The Reich was no longer fighting for victory, but to delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, daily life in Germany was becoming increasingly gripped by a mixture of fear, resignation, and fanaticism. Letters from soldiers arrived less and less frequently, and funerals became more and more common. Women, who became the backbone of the war effort, worked in factories, offices, and hospitals. While caring for their children under the constant threat of bombings, rationing became extreme. Bread was dark and scarce, meat almost non-existent, and heating an impossible luxury. Nevertheless, the regime insisted that every sacrifice was an act of loyalty to the Führer Goebbels, and Hitler understood that defeat was imminent, but their response was to demand even more. The words surrender or negotiation were forbidden. Anyone who hesitated was considered a traitor. Summary executions multiplied. In the final weeks of the conflict, fanaticism reached a grotesque point. 12 or 13-year-old children armed with rifles were sent to defend the streets of Berlin against Soviet tanks, The Reich had literally led an entire nation into war. Total war not only consumed Germany's material resources, it devoured its soul as well. What began as an ideal of national greatness ended up as a collective sacrifice. Millions of Germans died on the fronts, millions more were victims of misery and fire, and the entire country was reduced to ashes. But even amidst the rubble, the propaganda machine continued to function until the very last day, insisting that the sacrifice had not been in vain, that the Reich would rise from its ruins. When the Allies finally occupied Berlin in May 1945, the myth of the nation in arms crumbled. Cities were graveyards, roads were clogged with refugees, and survivors wandered among ruins that had once been symbols of power. The imperial dream had turned into a self-inflicted nightmare. Total war was the clearest reflection of the delirium that consumed the Third Reich, a regime that, unable to admit its defeat, decided to drag its entire population down with it into destruction. An entire society, shaped by years of indoctrination and fear, was transformed into a collective army, not by its own will, but by the manipulation of a power that confused sacrifice with salvation. In the end, only ruins, silence, and the memory of a nation that gave everything, not for freedom, but for a dream that should never have existed, remained. The Western Front, the enemy's return to Europe. On June 6, 1944, dawn broke over the Normandy coast, marking the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, for the Germans. That day was the realization of a long-foretold fear, the return of the Western enemy to European soil. For years, the Nazi regime had presented the Atlantic Wall as an impenetrable barrier, a steel and concrete wall that would protect the continent from any invasion attempt. However, the reality was different. Operation Overlord, the largest military amphibious landing in history, demonstrated that German power had begun to crumble. On the Western Front, German soldiers faced an enemy that was no longer the makeshift army of 1940, but an Allied machine vastly superior in resources, air power, logistics, and technology. For many in the Wehrmacht, the Battle of France was a desperate struggle against the inevitable. The armored divisions, symbols of German power in the early years of the war, were now shadows of their former selves, without fuel, without reinforcements, and under constant Allied bombardment. Entire cities were leveled from the air before enemy soldiers even set foot on the ground. Allied air superiority turned the skies into a killing field for any German movement, and the roads were littered with destroyed columns, tank wreckage, and charred bodies. The German High Command tried to maintain the illusion that the invasion could be contained. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had warned months earlier that if the Allies managed to establish a beachhead, the war would be lost. He was right. Despite his experience and his efforts to reinforce coastal defenses, he faced a war machine that combined impeccable strategy with overwhelming industrial production. The Wehrmacht reports described a chaotic situation. Entire units were being wiped out without being able to respond. Communication between commands was collapsing, and the once feared Luftwaffe had almost completely disappeared from the European skies. For German soldiers, the Western Front was a profoundly different experience from the Eastern Front. While there, they fought under the banner of an ideological war against Bolshevism. Here, they fought under the shadow of revenge. They knew that the enemy advancing through Normandy and then the Ardennes brought with it not only the military objective of defeating Germany, but also the desire to destroy the regime that had plunged the world into barbarism. However, many German fighters still fought with fanaticism and discipline. In French towns and villages, the resistance was fierce. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. Hitler's final attempt to reverse the situation came in December 1944 with the Ardennes offensive. It was the last desperate blow from a Reich on the verge of collapse for several weeks. The Germans managed to surprise the Allies, pushing back the front and sowing the illusion of an unlikely victory. But their fuel ran out, Allied artillery responded, and the counterattack ended in disaster. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured, and the Wehrmacht lost the last remnants of its offensive capability. From 1945 onward, the war in the West became an endless retreat. Germany was crumbling from within. Cities were smoldering ruins, refugees crowded the roads, and the army could barely hold out. When the Allies crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of the Reich, German soldiers knew the end was near. Many fought only to protect civilians. Others surrendered in the hope of avoiding capture by the Soviets. As the Western Front collapsed, Germany was experiencing the most chaotic and desperate period in its history. The regime's promises of a 1,000-year Reich had turned into smoldering ruins. The cities, once symbols of modernity and German power, were reduced to piles of rubble after the relentless Allied bombing. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Essen, each one was transformed into a hell of fire, and air raid sirens punctuated the routine of millions of civilians who spent their nights in underground shelters, praying that the next bomb wouldn't fall on their homes. The total war, proclaimed by Goebbels, had devoured its own people. The German soldiers fighting in the West were no longer the same fervent young men who had marched triumphantly in 1940. They were mostly inexperienced recruits, older men and teenagers forcibly taken from schools or factories, thrown to the front with little training and insufficient weaponry. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of discipline and military might, was now a shadow of its former self. Armored divisions lacked fuel, field hospitals were collapsing, and units were cut off by a lack of communications. Many soldiers knew the war was lost, but the fear of punishment for desertion or the hope of surviving one more day kept them going. In the final months of the conflict, Germany became a country besieged on all sides. From the east, the Red Army advanced with fury, laying waste to everything in its path as revenge for the horrors committed on Soviet soil from the west. The Allied armies, British, American, and Canadian, penetrated deep into the heart of the Reich. Each conquered town revealed the scars of war: concentration camps, mass executions, entire displaced populations. Nazi propaganda, which for years had promised an inevitable victory, crumbled in the face of the undeniable evidence of defeat. The myth of German invincibility was definitively shattered when the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945. Germany's most important defensive line, a symbol of its last attempt to resist, was overcome with devastating speed. Images of American tanks crossing the river under a grey sky became the harbinger of the end. At that moment, Hitler was still ordering impossible counterattacks from his bunker in Berlin, clinging to fantasies of non-existent divisions and imaginary victories. The Nazi leadership had completely lost touch with reality. The Führer spoke of sacrifice and heroism while his nation was dying of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. For civilians, defeat did not mean immediate relief, but rather even greater suffering. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the harshest. Cities lacked electricity, food, and drinking water. Millions of refugees fled the Soviet advance, dragging what little they had, desperately seeking refuge in a country that no longer existed. Mothers buried their children under the rubble, makeshift hospitals collapsed, and bodies were left piled up in the streets without being able to be buried. In the midst of that hell, the propaganda still insisted on resisting, on fighting to the last man, as if surrender were a betrayal of the homeland. The German army, trapped between two fronts and with no possibility of escape, fought until total exhaustion. Many officers, aware of the inevitability of defeat, chose to surrender to the Western Allies, hoping for more humane treatment than they knew they would receive from the Soviets. Others, loyal to the Führer until the end, fought to the last bullet, but neither fanaticism nor discipline could alter fate. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 was the final act of a drama that had begun with the dream of world domination and ended with a nation in ruins and a lost generation. As the Allied troops advanced through Germany, the myth of the invincible Reich disintegrated before their eyes. The soldiers who once believed themselves masters of Europe surrendered with their hands raised, exhausted and defeated. German military pride, forged over centuries, lay buried beneath the rubble of Nazism. The images of Hitler in his bunker, refusing to accept reality, reflected not only the madness of one man, but the moral collapse of an entire system. The Western Front was more than a battlefield. It was the symbolic stage for the collapse of the Third Reich. There, among the ruins of the cities and the columns of smoke, Germany's imperial ambition was definitively extinguished. Europe, devastated and covered in scars, emerged from the conflict with a single certainty: the price of fanaticism and war had been too high. The imperial dream that had promised greatness and unity ended up revealing itself as a nightmare that left behind millions of dead, a divided continent, and a humanity forever marked by the horror of its own creation. The collapse of the Reich, ruins and despair. By early 1945, the Third Reich was no longer the empire Hitler had envisioned. It was a land in ruins, a dying body bleeding out on all fronts. The lightning victories of the past seemed a distant memory, almost a fable. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, laying waste to every German city in its path. In the west, the Allies crossed the Rhine and prepared for the final offensive on Berlin. Germany was trapped, surrounded by fire and vengeance. The cities that once symbolized the power of the Reich were now piles of rubble. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, all had become apocalyptic landscapes. The streets were covered in dust, the trees uprooted, and the rivers filled with human remains. Allied bombing had reduced the German infrastructure to ashes. There was no electricity, no water, no transportation. The trains barely ran, communications were intermittent, and hunger spread like a shadow. Corpses were so common that no one counted them anymore. For millions of civilians, the end of the Reich brought not relief, but fear. Columns of refugees, women, the elderly, and children advanced through the snow and mud, trying to escape the Soviet advance. Many walked for weeks, with only a few crumbs of bread and the hope of finding refuge in the West. On the roads, aerial bombardments claimed lives. Every day, those who didn't die from the bullets succumbed to cold or exhaustion. It was the largest exodus in modern European history. Amid this chaos, Nazi propaganda continued to operate. Clinging to a reality that no longer existed, Joseph Goebbels asserted in his final bulletins that victory was still possible, that the Führer was preparing a secret weapon that would change the course of the war, but no one believed him anymore. Faith in Hitler, which for years had been almost religious, was slowly crumbling. Rumors about his health, his isolation, and his inability to face reality were spreading even among his most loyal followers. The dictator had locked himself in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. From there, surrounded by useless maps and exhausted generals, he continued to issue impossible orders. He demanded counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed, sent reinforcements that would never arrive, and spoke of imaginary victories. His view of the world had shrunk to a dark basement, while above his head, Berlin burned under the bombings. In the streets, despair mingled with fanaticism. The remnants of the Hitler youth, barely teenagers, were being recruited to defend the ruins of the capital. 13 or 14-year-old boys carried grenade launchers against Soviet tanks. Knowing they stood no chance, Hitler called them the last soldiers of the Reich, and Goebbels celebrated them as heroes. In reality, they were victims, the final sacrifice of a nation manipulated to the very end. The Gestapo and the SS continued to execute those who showed signs of surrender or despair. In the villages, any civilian who tried to raise a white flag or flee the front was hanged in the main square with a sign that read, "Traitor to the Fatherland." Blind loyalty to the Führer had defied all logic. Even when Soviet troops were just a few kilometers from the heart of Berlin, official speeches continued to repeat that victory was near. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched its final offensive on the German capital. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers surrounded Berlin in a matter of days. The street-by-street battles were brutal. Every building, every bridge, every intersection became a makeshift fortress. The cannons shook the ground, rubble formed mountains, and bodies were piled on the sidewalks. In basements, civilians took refuge, listening to the rumble of tanks and the whiz of shells. Many, unable to bear the weight, committed suicide before the Soviets arrived. Inside the bunker, the Führer's world was crumbling. Reports came in one after another. The northern armies had collapsed, the southern units were surrendering, and the Allies were already at the gates. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life. With his suicide, the myth of the thousand-year Reich collapsed in an instant. Goebbels and his wife followed his example a few hours later, first murdering their 6 children. In a matter of days, what had been the most powerful regime in Europe ceased to exist. Berlin fell on May 2nd. Soviet flags flew over the Reichstag as survivors slowly emerged from the shelters. What they found was indescribable, a landscape of ruins, corpses, and silence. The smell of death permeated the air. Soviet soldiers patrolled the streets amidst the rubble, while civilians searched for food among the wreckage of destroyed houses. The pride of the Reich had been reduced to dust. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. Europe celebrated the end of the war, but for the Germans, the long process of facing their own destruction was only just beginning. The country was divided, cities razed, and millions homeless. The army was annihilated, the economy collapsed, and national morale shattered. The population was caught between guilt, denial, and shame. No one knew how to start over. The Allies soon discovered the true extent of Nazi horror. As they advanced, they liberated the concentration camps and saw with their own eyes the piles of bodies, the ovens, the crematoria, and the emaciated survivors. Images of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were seen around the world. They were irrefutable proof of the death system the Reich had built. The idea of a victim Germany crumbled. The country now had to face the magnitude of its crimes. In the following months, German territory was occupied, divided, and administered by the victorious powers. Millions of soldiers were taken prisoner, Nazi leaders were tried at Nuremberg, and symbols of the regime were banned. But beyond formal justice, the true defeat was moral. The people who had once believed in the dream of an eternal Reich now found themselves surrounded by ashes, their gaze lost and their consciences burdened with questions that would take generations to answer. The ruins of the Reich were not just made of stone and cement. They were the ruins of a nation that had surrendered its destiny to obedience and fanaticism. Every collapsed building, every destroyed family, every lost life spoke of the price paid when ideology is imposed on humanity. In the streets of Berlin, amidst the rubble and the silence, the echo of that war still resonated. A reminder of how pride and despair can drag an entire people towards their own destruction. After the fire, guilt, silence, and reconstruction. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Germany was a country in ruins, not only physically but morally and spiritually. Cities had been reduced to piles of rubble, rivers were filled with human remains, and roads were teeming with aimless refugees. Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, Nuremberg. What were once symbols of modernity and culture were now ghostly landscapes where life barely survived amidst the dust and silence. The fires of war had ravaged everything, leaving behind a void that not even the Allied victory could fill. Millions of Germans survived the end of the conflict without homes, food, and above all, answers. Families were shattered. Sons who never returned from the front, fathers who had disappeared in the east, women scarred by violence and despair. Among the ruins, the survivors moved like shadows, searching for meaning in what had happened. Many still believed they had fought for a just cause. Others were slowly beginning to grasp the magnitude of the deception they had been subjected to. Guilt, however, did not come immediately. During the first months after the surrender, the priority was simply survival. The Allied troops imposed a strict occupation regime, rationing, total disarmament, and the elimination of all traces of Nazism. The Germans were forced to confront the crimes committed in their name. In many cities, residents were led to the newly liberated concentration camps, forced to see the piles of corpses, the crematorium ovens, the remnants of the barbarity they had chosen to ignore. The images spoke for themselves. The Third Reich had not been a heroic dream, but a collective nightmare. Even so, silence prevailed. It was a heavy, uncomfortable silence, masking guilt and fear. In homes, schools, and streets, the past was rarely discussed. Many claimed to know nothing. Others asserted they were simply following orders. It was easier to remain silent than to face the truth. The entire country seemed intent on burying its history beneath the rubble. But the ruins were not only in the cities, but also in people's consciences. At the Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1946, the world witnessed an attempt to bring justice to crimes that seemed impossible to prosecute. 24 high-ranking Nazi officials were tried, accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: signed documents, film footage, testimonies, written orders. For the first time in history, the victors were not only punishing the enemy, but also establishing a new notion of moral responsibility. "I was just following orders" is no longer an excuse, but beyond the courts, German society remained fragmented, unable to look at itself in the mirror. The Allied occupation zones divided the country into 4 parts: American, British, French, and Soviet. From this division emerged 2 Germanys: the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. 2 nations, 2 memories, 2 different ways of dealing with the past. In the West, under the influence of the United States, Reconstruction focused on the economy and the creation of a new democratic system. In the East, under Soviet control, the official discourse blamed exclusively Western capitalism and Nazism, denying collective responsibility. But on both sides, the same silence persisted. Between 1945 and 1950, the country underwent one of the most difficult reconstruction processes in modern history. The German miracle, as it was later called, began with ruins. Women, known as the Trümmerfrauen, the women of the rubble, became the symbol of that first stage. With shovels, buckets, and bare hands, they cleaned the streets, removed stones, and built new homes. In a country where millions of men had died or were prisoners, it was they who kept hope alive. But while the cities were reborn, the inner wounds remained open. The new generation, the children who had grown up among the ruins, began to ask questions. What did their parents do during the war? What did the words Auschwitz or Treblinka, barely whispered, mean? In the 1960s, this generation of young people challenged the silence, demanded explanations, and forced Germany to confront its past without filters. Thus, a new historical consciousness was born, memory as a responsibility. In the East, the communist regime used the anti-fascist narrative for political legitimacy. They presented themselves as the true victors over Nazism, but prohibited any independent discussion of the regime's crimes. In the West, the process was slow and painful. Many former Reich officials were reintegrated into the civil service or industry. A country could not be rebuilt without those who knew how it functioned, and this contradiction plagued Germany for years. As time passed, the visible scars faded away. Cities were rebuilt, the economy flourished, and the new Federal Republic of Germany became a world power. But beneath that prosperity, a question remained: how to live with the guilt of having been part of the greatest crime in modern history. The response was not immediate, but over the years, Germany learned that remembering was the only path to redemption. Museums, monuments, and memorial centers began to be built throughout the country. In schools, the Holocaust was taught not as someone else's tragedy, but as a personal responsibility. Generations born after the war grew up understanding that silence is the first ally of horror. Thus, little by little, the country that once sank into darkness learned to live with its past, not to justify it, but to avoid repeating it. After the fire, Germany had to rebuild not only its cities, but also its soul. Reconstruction meant accepting the truth, confronting guilt, and bearing the weight of history. The ruins became foundations, and memory became a warning. Because from the ashes of the Reich, not only a new nation emerged, but also an eternal lesson. Power can destroy, but only memory can heal. Between memory and shame. To speak of Germany and the Second World War is to delve into one of the most complex and profound chapters in human history. It is to speak of the weight of the past, of a nation that reached the heights of power and the depths of barbarity. Rarely has a country had to confront such an overwhelming moral burden. 20th century Germany didn't just lose a war, it lost its soul, its reputation, and its place in the world. The defeat of 1945 wasn't just the collapse of a regime, but the collapse of an idea, the belief that greatness could be built on oppression, fear, and extermination. From the ashes of Berlin, a new Germany emerged, which, before rising again, had to look in the mirror and recognize the face of the horror it had created. In the years following the conflict, the country found itself fragmented both physically and spiritually. The material ruins were visible on every street, but the moral ruins ran much deeper. Germany was divided. In the West, under the occupation of the Allied powers; in the East, under the control of the Soviet Union. This fracture was not only political, but also emotional. Post-war Germans had to learn to live with collective guilt and the stigma of Nazism. The images of the concentration camps, revealed to the world after liberation, showed a reality that many within the country itself had refused to see. German society was in a state of shock. For the first time, they had to accept that evil had not come from outside, but had sprung from the very heart of their nation. In West Germany, under the influence of the United States, a process of denazification began, aimed at eliminating any trace of the regime from public and political life. Trials, such as those at Nuremberg, exposed the crimes of the Third Reich to the world with a starkness that shocked even the victors. Those hearings, in which respectable-looking men confessed to having organized deportations, executions, or human experiments, marked the beginning of a new global awareness of individual responsibility in times of war. However, denazification was an uneven process. Many perpetrators escaped, sought refuge in South America, or resumed their lives under new identities. German society, torn apart, wavered between the desire to forget and the need to remember. Meanwhile, in East Germany, the communist regime used anti-fascist rhetoric to legitimize itself, presenting itself as the new Germany free of Nazis. But on both sides of the wall, the wound remained open. In the West, children grew up asking their parents, "Where were you?" In the East, silence was imposed by censorship. The post-war period was, for a long time, an era of muteness. The trauma was too great, the shame too heavy. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, with the rise of a new generation that hadn't lived through the conflict, that Germany began to speak openly about its past. Films, books, and public debates broke the silence, and the country began to rebuild not only its economy, but also its conscience. The material reconstruction was a miracle, but the moral one was a slower and more painful process. The Federal Republic of Germany became a symbol of democratic rebirth, driven by leaders like Konrad Adenauer, who understood that the only path to redemption was truth. Historical education was promoted, memorials were erected, and the Holocaust was included as an essential part of the school curriculum. Each generation grew up knowing that memory was a responsibility, not an option. In the East, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, reunification brought with it a new era of self-criticism and reassessment. A unified Germany inherited not only the glory of prosperity, but also the duty to keep the memory of the horror alive. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, inaugurated in 2005, stands as a symbol of that active memory. It does not celebrate victories or heroes. With its 2,711 grey and asymmetrical blocks, it conveys disorientation, emptiness, and loss. It is a metaphor for what it means to confront a past that is impossible to fully understand. Just a few meters away, the site of Hitler's bunker remains empty, without monuments, without tributes, as a conscious decision by modern Germany, never to glorify the executioner, but always to remember the victims. Germany's relationship with its past is also reflected in its international policy. Since World War II, the country has adopted a deeply pacifist stance, avoiding militarism and prioritizing diplomacy and cooperation. European integration, with Germany as its economic engine, was in part an attempt at redemption, to transform the power that once destroyed Europe into a force for unity and stability. This policy, based on historical responsibility, has shaped contemporary German identity. However, the weight of the past does not disappear. Current generations still live with the echo of that collective shame. In literature, film, and education, Nazism remains a central theme, not as an open wound, but as a constant warning, because Germany understood that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. In a world where extremist rhetoric is resurging and historical revisionism threatens the truth, Germany has made memory its moral shield. The ruins of the Reich became the foundation of a new nation that, far from denying its past, confronts it every day. The rebuilt stones of the destroyed cities are more than architecture. They are witnesses to a people who chose to look the abyss straight in the face and, instead of falling into it again, used it as a mirror. Germany did not free itself from the past by destroying it, but by remembering it today. Amidst memory and shame, Germany stands as an example of historical redemption. It is no longer defined by the crimes of Nazism, but by its commitment to the truth. He understood that patriotism is not about hiding the stains of the past, but about preventing them from being repeated. The greatest legacy of the 20th century lies not in monuments or trials, but in that lesson learned, that memory, however painful, is the price of humanity. Because when the past is forgotten, horror always finds its way back. Germany chose to remember, and in doing so, it also chose to protect everyone's future. That is its true victory, having transformed shame into awareness and pain into an eternal warning.